the humid summer of 1837, a daguerreotype was taken at Magnolia Grove Plantation, just outside Mobile, Alabama. The image captured what appeared to be a routine gathering, but hidden within its edges was evidence of something far darker. The plantation belonged to Catherine Rousseau, a French Creole widow who had inherited the estate after her husband's suspicious death 2 years prior. Court records from Mobile County mention the property only briefly, noting irregularities in slave management practices, before the file was sealed by order of the county judge. The silence that followed would last nearly 2 centuries. Local historians who stumbled upon fragmentary evidence in 2019 described finding references to 5 enslaved men who disappeared from official records between March and August of 1837. Their names, Samuel, Isaiah, Moses, Benjamin, and Thomas, appeared in purchase ledgers but vanished from subsequent documentation. No sale records exist. No death certificates were filed. They simply ceased to exist on paper, though oral histories passed down through descendants of the enslaved community spoke of the ceremony house and the widow's rituals in hushed, fearful tones. What makes this case particularly disturbing is not just the disappearances but the systematic cover-up that followed. Mobile's elite society, deeply interconnected through marriage and business, closed ranks around the widow. Letters discovered in a private collection in 2023 reveal that at least 3 prominent attorneys and a circuit court judge knew of allegations against Catherine Rousseau, but actively suppressed investigations. One letter, dated September 1837, coldly states, "The matter of the Rousseau property has been resolved to everyone's satisfaction. No further inquiry is warranted." The truth began to emerge only when renovation work at what remained of the old plantation site uncovered a concealed chamber beneath the main house in 2024. What archaeologists found there, ritual implements, restraints, and human remains, confirmed the darkest fears whispered across generations. This is the story of how one woman's depravity was protected by an entire system, and how the 5 men whose lives she destroyed were erased from history until their bones finally spoke. Before we continue, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Here, we unearth secrets buried by official history and give voice to what was silenced. Chapter 1: The Widow of Magnolia Grove. The plantation known as Magnolia Grove sat on 340 acres of rich Alabama soil, its Greek Revival mansion visible from the Mobile River on clear days. In January 1835, Jacques Rousseau died suddenly at age 42. The official cause was listed as brain fever, but enslaved workers at the plantation told a different story among themselves. They spoke of screaming from the master bedroom that lasted 3 days, of the widow emerging with blood on her hands and a strange satisfaction in her eyes, of the doctor who examined the body turning pale and refusing to speak of what he'd seen. Catherine Rousseau was 31 when she became a widow. Born in New Orleans to a French Creole family with rumored connections to Haitian refugees, she had married Jacques at 17 in what was described as a business arrangement between families. Neighbors remembered her as educated, fluent in French, English, and a smattering of African languages she claimed to have learned from her childhood nurse. She was also known for her intense interest in what polite society called exotic practices, a collection of books on Caribbean folk religion, frequent visits to practitioners in Mobile's mixed-race districts, and an unnerving habit of staring at people as though seeing through them. After her husband's death, Catherine assumed complete control of the plantation. This was unusual but not unheard of for widows with no male heirs. What was unusual was her approach to management. She dismissed the overseer who had run the property for 12 years, claiming she would manage the enslaved workforce herself. She instituted new rules. Certain slaves were to report directly to the main house after dark, particular sections of the property were declared off-limits, and any enslaved person caught speaking to visitors would face severe punishment. The first signs of something deeply wrong appeared in early March 1837. A merchant visiting from Mobile noted in his diary that he'd been turned away at the gate by an enslaved woman who seemed terrified beyond reason. When he later asked about Magnolia Grove in town, conversations would abruptly end. A lawyer he knew well took him aside and advised him to forget about the Rousseau place entirely. In that same month, Catherine purchased 5 male slaves at a mobile auction. The auctioneer's ledger, preserved in county archives, records their names and ages: Samuel 28, Isaiah 24, Moses 30, Benjamin 22, and Thomas 26. All were described as field hands in prime condition. The purchase price was unusually high, nearly double the going rate, and Catherine paid in cash, insisting on immediate transfer without the customary inspection period. What happened next would be obscured by decades of deliberate silence. But the enslaved community at Magnolia Grove knew. They saw the 5 men confined to a separate building near the main house. They heard construction sounds at night, hammering, digging, the movement of heavy materials. They noticed that Catherine began spending hours in this building, often emerging only at dawn. And they observed that the widow, who had always been pale, now seemed to glow with an unnatural vitality. By April, the other enslaved workers at Magnolia Grove began to fear for their lives. Several attempted to run, though flight from coastal Alabama was nearly impossible. Those who were caught received brutal public punishments designed to terrify the others into submission. Catherine herself presided over these punishments, watching with the same unsettling intensity she brought to everything she did. The 5 men were rarely seen after the first month. When they did appear, witnesses later recalled they seemed altered, thin, hollow-eyed, moving as though in a trance. An elderly woman who had been enslaved at the neighboring plantation told her great-granddaughter, decades later, that she'd seen them once through the trees, lined up outside the mysterious building while Catherine walked among them with a silver bowl, speaking words in a language that made the listener's skin crawl. Then, in early August 1837, the 5 men vanished completely. No one saw them leave. No sales were recorded. They simply disappeared, as though they had never existed. Chapter 2. The Daguerreotype and the Silence. The photograph that would later become known as the 1837 mobile image was discovered in a Boston estate sale in 1981. The daguerreotype, one of the earliest photographic processes, showed a plantation house with several figures visible in the background. For decades, it remained an unremarkable artifact of the antebellum South, displayed briefly in a small museum before being moved to storage. It wasn't until 2019 that a researcher specializing in early photography techniques noticed something disturbing. Using digital enhancement technology, she enlarged the background figures. What emerged from the shadows was chilling. 5 men standing in a rigid line, their faces bearing expressions of what could only be described as absolute terror, while a woman in dark clothing stood before them holding what appeared to be a ceremonial vessel. The angle and quality made positive identification impossible, but the location matched known images of Magnolia Grove, and the date, inscribed on the plate's edge, was August 3, 1837. The discovery sent researchers to Mobile's historical archives. What they found was a pattern of erasure so systematic it suggested coordinated effort. Property records for Magnolia Grove during Catherine Rousseau's ownership were incomplete, with several pages clearly removed from bound volumes. Slave registers maintained by the county showed the purchase of the 5 men in March, but no subsequent entries. Death records, typically meticulous in documenting slave mortality for insurance purposes, were blank. More disturbing were the gaps in legal records. Mobile County Court minutes from 1837 showed that a grand jury had been convened in September to investigate allegations of irregularities at the Rousseau property. 3 witnesses had been subpoenaed, all enslaved workers from Magnolia Grove. The proceedings were scheduled for October 15, 1837, but the minutes for that date were missing, cut cleanly from the bound volume. The next entry, dated October 22nd, noted only that the matter concerning Mrs. C. Rousseau has been resolved satisfactorily. Private correspondence discovered in 2023 revealed what resolved satisfactorily meant. A letter from Judge William Ashford to attorney Marcus Chamberlain stated, "The widow has agreed to certain modifications in her household management. In exchange, we have deemed it prudent to seal all related documents. The alternative, a public trial, would damage too many reputations, including our own. 3 of Mobile's finest families have business connections to Magnolia Grove. The matter ends here. Another letter, this one from Chamberlain to an unknown recipient, was more explicit. The slaves who were to testify have been dispersed. 2 sold to Mississippi, 1 to Georgia. The others have been made to understand the consequences of speaking further. Mrs. Rousseau retains her property and her freedom. We retain our standing. The alternative was unthinkable. The 3 enslaved witnesses who were supposed to testify vanished from records as completely as the 5 men had. Their names appeared on sale documents dated October 10, 1837, 5 days before the scheduled hearing. The buyers were listed as agents from out-of-state plantations, but subsequent research has failed to locate any records of these individuals arriving at their supposed destinations. What had they been prepared to testify about? Family histories passed down through generations of descendants offered fragmentary clues. One account, recorded in the 1920s by a folklorist interviewing elderly formerly enslaved people, mentioned the ceremony house where the widow drank strength from chosen men. Another, from the 1950s, described 5 brothers who entered the dark building and never came out walking right, until they didn't come out at all. Mobile society's complicity extended beyond legal suppression. Social records show that Catherine Rousseau remained an accepted, if somewhat mysterious, figure in the city's elite circles until her death in 1859. She attended balls, donated to churches, and maintained business relationships with the same families whose lawyers had protected her. When she died, her obituary in the Mobile Register praised her as a woman of refinement and culture who managed her affairs with uncommon capability. The plantation itself passed to distant relatives after her death. They sold it in 1862, and subsequent owners made substantial modifications to the property. By the time of the Civil War, the original structures had been altered beyond recognition. The ceremony house that figured so prominently in oral histories was demolished in the 1870s during a renovation, its materials scattered or buried. For more than 140 years, the case remained buried beneath layers of deliberate forgetting and institutional complicity. Chapter 3. Blood and Ritual. Understanding. What happened at Magnolia Grove requires understanding the religious landscape of the antebellum South, particularly in port cities like Mobile, where multiple cultures collided. The city's proximity to New Orleans and the Caribbean meant that African spiritual practices, often syncretized with Catholicism, persisted despite brutal suppression efforts. Practitioners were usually enslaved people or free persons of color who maintained these traditions at great personal risk. Catherine Rousseau's interest in these practices was, by all accounts, different. While most adherents sought healing, protection, or justice within a framework of reciprocity and respect for spiritual forces, Catherine appears to have approached these traditions as a means of personal power acquisition. Letters she wrote to a contact in New Orleans, discovered in a private collection in 2022, discuss ceremonies of transference and the extraction of vitality from the unwilling. The building where the 5 men were kept was described in later accounts as isolated, windowless, and constructed with unusual materials. Archaeological investigation of the site in 2024 revealed that its foundation incorporated iron nails arranged in specific patterns, practices associated with certain Caribbean spiritual traditions meant to contain or channel forces. The interior had been designed with a central area surrounded by smaller chambers, consistent with descriptions of ritual spaces. What Catherine called ceremonies appeared to follow a systematic pattern. According to fragmented accounts from enslaved witnesses, the rituals occurred during specific lunar phases and involved the 5 men being brought together while Catherine performed elaborate procedures. The silver bowl mentioned in eyewitness accounts was likely used in what some traditions call blood work, practices involving the controlled extraction and ceremonial use of blood for spiritual purposes. But Catherine's version of these ceremonies bore little resemblance to traditional practices. Where authentic traditions emphasized balance, reciprocity, and respect for those involved, Catherine's rituals were purely extractive. The 5 men were not participants but victims, subjected to repeated trauma designed to break their will and make them vessels for whatever forces Catherine believed she was manipulating. The physical evidence discovered in 2024 supported the darkest interpretations. In the concealed chamber beneath the main house, archaeologists found restraint systems, ceremonial implements including the silver bowl mentioned in oral histories, and, most damning, human remains showing signs of systematic abuse and what forensic anthropologists described as evidence of repeated blood extraction procedures. The remains of 5 individuals were recovered. DNA analysis, when possible, suggested they were the men purchased in March 1837. The condition of the remains indicated they had died at different times over several months, consistent with Catherine's progressive harvesting of their vitality. The final individual appeared to have died in late July or early August 1837, around the time of the daguerreotype. What makes this case particularly disturbing is not just the violence itself, but the perversion of spiritual practices meant to honor and protect into tools of systematic abuse. Catherine had taken fragments of Caribbean traditions, stripped them of their ethical framework and community context, and twisted them into something monstrous. She wasn't seeking spiritual connection or healing. She was attempting to literally drain the life force from human beings for her own enhancement. Enslaved workers at the plantation, many of whom came from West African or Caribbean backgrounds and understood fragments of these traditions, recognized what was happening as a profound violation. In their accounts passed down through generations, they described Catherine as someone who had turned the power inside out and made medicine into poison. They understood that what she was doing went beyond the everyday horrors of slavery into something spiritually corrupting. By August 1837, when the daguerreotype was taken, 4 of the 5 men were already dead. Their bodies had been disposed of somewhere on the property, likely in the concealed chamber that would later be discovered. The 5th man, Thomas, the youngest of the 5, died shortly after. The photograph captured what may have been his final day of life, standing with 4 men who were already corpses or close to death while Catherine performed her final ceremony. Now, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're hearing this story. I want to know how far these silenced accounts reach. Chapter 4. The System of Silence. The question that haunts researchers is not whether Catherine Rousseau committed these crimes, the evidence is overwhelming, but how she continued operating with impunity despite multiple witnesses and growing suspicion. The answer reveals the systematic mechanisms through which elite white society protected its own, even when its own included someone engaging in practices that horrified even hardened stakeholders in the slave system. The first layer of protection was economic. Magnolia Grove was not Catherine's only asset. Through her late husband's family connections, she held partnerships in 3 mobile shipping firms, 2 cotton brokerage houses, and a bank. A detailed analysis of business records from the 1830s shows that at least 17 of Mobile's most prominent families had financial ties to Catherine's enterprises. An investigation into her activities would require examining her business dealings, potentially exposing financial irregularities that could damage all involved parties. Judge William Ashford, who ultimately sealed the investigation records, owned shares in the same shipping firms as Catherine. Marcus Chamberlain, the attorney who coordinated the witness dispersal, had represented Catherine in multiple property disputes and stood to lose significant legal fees if she were prosecuted. The district attorney who chose not to pursue charges had borrowed money from one of Catherine's banking partnerships. The interconnections were so dense that prosecuting Catherine would have meant implicating Mobile's entire power structure. The second layer was social. Mobile's elite society in the 1830s was small, tightly knit, and obsessed with respectability. Catherine, despite her strangeness, came from a respected Creole family and had married into one of Mobile's founding dynasties. She knew secrets, business indiscretions, financial problems, affairs, that made her dangerous to expose. Several letters from the period hint at this mutual vulnerability. One, from a prominent merchant's wife, warns her husband to leave the Rousseau matter alone, lest our own arrangements come to light. The third layer was the fundamental dehumanization of enslaved people within the legal system. Even in cases where white perpetrators of violence against slaves were prosecuted, convictions were rare and sentences light. The law treated enslaved people as property, and damaging one's own property was generally not a crime. For Catherine to face serious consequences, prosecutors would have needed to prove that her actions went beyond excessive discipline into territory that violated even slavery's loose boundaries, a nearly impossible standard. Moreover, the testimony of enslaved witnesses was legally restricted. In Alabama, slaves could testify in court only in limited circumstances, and their testimony was given far less weight than that of white witnesses. The 3 enslaved workers who were subpoenaed to testify before the grand jury in 1837 would have faced intense skepticism from white jurors and judges predisposed to disbelieve accusations against a white property owner. Their testimony, no matter how compelling, would have needed corroboration from white witnesses, and no white person was willing to speak against Catherine. The system's 4th protective layer was the mechanism of dispersal and intimidation. The 3 witnesses were sold to distant plantations before they could testify, a common tactic for silencing inconvenient slaves. Even if they had managed to tell their stories later, they would have been hundreds of miles from Mobile, separated from any corroborating witnesses or evidence. Meanwhile, the remaining enslaved population at Magnolia Grove received a clear message. Speak about what you've seen and you'll be separated from your families and sent to places where your fate would be entirely uncertain. Financial documents from October 1837 show a large payment from Catherine to an individual identified only as J.R. for services rendered in resolution of legal matters. This was almost certainly a bribe paid to ensure the investigation ended. The amount, $2,400, roughly equivalent to $80 Sun dollars today, suggests it was distributed among multiple parties. In a society where corruption was normalized and enslaved people had no legal recourse, such payments were routine. Perhaps most chilling is how completely the system succeeded. Within months of the investigation being shut down, references to the Rousseau affair disappeared from private correspondence. By 1840, new residents of Mobile would have heard nothing about it. The story survived only in the oral traditions of the enslaved community and their descendants, passed down as a warning about the depths of cruelty that could hide behind respectable facades. The same families who protected Catherine in 1837 would go on to lead Mobile through the Civil War and Reconstruction. Some of their descendants rose to positions of power in the 20th century. None of them faced consequences for their ancestors' complicity in murder. The institutions they controlled, courts, banks, churches, continued operating as though nothing had happened. History, as written by those in power, simply erased Catherine's victims as efficiently as she had. Chapter 5. The descendants remember, while official records fell silent. Memory persisted in communities descended from enslaved people. The story of the widow's ceremony house became one of many cautionary tales passed down through generations, usually shared in specific contexts, when warning young people about the nature of evil, when explaining why certain places should be avoided, or when teaching history that would never appear in textbooks. In the 1920s, folklorist Zora Neale Hurston spent time in Mobile collecting stories as part of her broader documentation of African American oral traditions in the South. Though her main focus was on folklore and religious practices, she recorded fragments that appear to reference the Magnolia Grove case. In her field notes, she mentions an elderly woman named Clara Washington who spoke of a plantation where a widow did devil work with men's blood, and the law did nothing because she was white and had money. Clara Washington's account, recorded when she was in her 90s, came from her grandmother who had been enslaved at a plantation near Magnolia Grove. The grandmother, whose name was not recorded, claimed she had known 2 of the 5 men before they were purchased by Catherine. They was good men, the account states, strong and proud. Then the widow bought them and they went into that house and came out different. Then they stopped coming out at all. Similar stories emerged periodically throughout the 20th century. In 1958, a local historian conducting interviews for a project on Mobile County found several elderly African American residents who knew versions of the tale. One man, James Butler, age 83, said his great-grandfather had been enslaved at Magnolia Grove and had witnessed ceremonies that would make your blood run cold. Butler said his great-grandfather refused to speak about the details, but had made the family promise to remember the 5 men's names: Samuel, Isaiah, Moses, Benjamin, and Thomas. The persistence of these names through multiple generations, despite the absence of written records, is remarkable. It suggests a deliberate effort to preserve the memory of the victims when official history tried to erase them. Family Bibles from several African American families in Mobile contain the 5 names written in the back pages with dates of death in 1837, though these individuals had no direct connection to the families recording them. It was an act of historical preservation and resistance, ensuring that someone remembered. In 1989, a community organization in Mobile erected a small memorial to the forgotten victims of slavery. The names of Samuel, Isaiah, Moses, Benjamin, and Thomas were included among hundreds of others. At the time, historians dismissed their inclusion as based on folklore rather than documentation. The memorial's creator, Dorothy Hayes, whose family had lived in Mobile since the 1840s, responded that just because white people didn't write it down doesn't mean it didn't happen. The archaeological discovery in 2024 vindicated these memory keepers. When the concealed chamber was found beneath the old plantation house site, and 5 bodies were recovered with evidence of systematic abuse and ceremonial trauma, researchers immediately contacted descendants of Mobile's African American community. Multiple families came forward with their oral histories, and the details aligned remarkably well with the physical evidence. DNA testing, where possible, has begun establishing connections between the remains and living descendants. 2 of the 5 men had fathered children before being purchased by Catherine, children who were sold separately and whose descendants eventually made their way to various parts of the country. The process of reunion, connecting the bones with the stories with the living people who carry both forward, has been emotionally overwhelming. One descendant, Michael Thompson, whose great-great-great-grandfather Isaiah was one of the 5 victims, spoke at a memorial service in 2025. My family told this story for almost 200 years. People told us we were exaggerating, that it couldn't have been that bad, that we were being too harsh about the past. Now we know. They tried to erase these men from history, but we wouldn't let them disappear. We held their names in our hearts when no one else would. The descendants have organized efforts to ensure this history is properly acknowledged. They've pushed for historical markers at the plantation site, advocated for curriculum changes in local schools to include the case, and worked with researchers to document every fragment of evidence. Their goal is not revenge. The perpetrators and their immediate protectors are long dead, but recognition. They want the 5 men's names restored to history and the systematic cover-up acknowledged as part of Mobile's past. This effort faces resistance. Some local historians and preservation groups have argued that focusing on one alleged incident unfairly characterizes the region's history. Descendants of families connected to the cover-up have expressed discomfort with having their ancestors' complicity exposed. But the descendants of the victims have been unwavering. Truth, no matter how uncomfortable, must be told. The oral histories also contain information that may never be verified, but carries its own truth. Several accounts mention that other enslaved people at Magnolia Grove performed protective rituals to prevent Catherine from harming more victims. Some claim that Catherine's relatively early death in 1859 was the result of spiritual consequences from her crimes. Whether or not one believes in such forces, these stories reveal how the enslaved community understood and resisted what was happening, even when the legal system failed them. Chapter 6. Justice, Centuries Late. The archaeological discoveries of 2024 created an unprecedented situation. Clear physical evidence of murder and systematic abuse from nearly 2 centuries ago, connecting to documented historical records and persistent oral histories. While criminal prosecution was obviously impossible, all direct perpetrators and accomplices died long ago, the findings forced a long overdue reckoning with how institutions had protected those crimes. Mobile County was compelled to address the sealed court records. In March 2025, a coalition of descendants, historians, and civil rights organizations petitioned the county to unseal all documents related to the 1837 investigation. After initial resistance, county officials agreed to create a historical commission to review the materials and make them public. What they revealed was devastating. The sealed records contained testimony from the 3 enslaved witnesses that was never heard by the grand jury. Their accounts described the 5 men being subjected to repeated traumatic rituals, Catherine's obsession with drawing strength from them, and the progressive deterioration of the men's physical and mental condition. One witness described finding what appeared to be blood-stained ceremonial items and clothing in the building, where the men were kept. Another testified to hearing screaming and begging coming from the structure late at night. Most damning were the letters between Judge Ashford, Attorney Chamberlain, and other prominent Mobile citizens discussing how to manage the situation. These documents revealed not just passive complicity but active conspiracy to obstruct justice. They showed that multiple white witnesses had also come forward with concerns about Catherine's activities, but were pressured into silence. One witness, a neighboring plantation owner, wrote that he had been told explicitly that pursuing the matter would destroy your reputation and business prospects in this county. The judge's private correspondence included a remarkable passage. I have no doubt that Mrs. Rousseau engaged in practices that would appall decent society. However, the greater harm would come from public revelation. The slave system depends on maintaining white solidarity. If we allow one of our own to be prosecuted for excessive treatment of her property, we open a door that could never be closed. Better to quietly resolve the matter and ensure it happens no differently. This frank admission that protecting the slave system took precedence over addressing even extreme crimes became central to how historians understood not just this case, but the broader functioning of antebellum Southern justice. The system wasn't failing to protect enslaved people. It was working exactly as designed to protect enslavers at all costs. The sealed records also revealed that other enslaved people beyond the 3 witnesses had attempted to report Catherine's actions. A free black man who worked as a ferryman on the Mobile River had told authorities about suspicious nighttime activities he'd observed at the plantation. His testimony was dismissed without investigation. 2 enslaved women who had been brought to work in Catherine's house for a brief period reported disturbing scenes to a sympathetic white minister, who initially attempted to raise concerns with authorities before being warned to drop the matter. All of these suppressed testimonies, now public, painted a picture of a community, both black and some white residents, that knew something terrible was happening but was powerless against the institutional forces protecting Catherine. The conspiracy of silence wasn't passive ignorance, but active suppression of truth in service of protecting elite white power. In October 2025, Mobile held a formal acknowledgement ceremony at the site of the former Magnolia Grove plantation. The county government issued an official apology for the 1837 cover-up and for the institutional failures that allowed Catherine Rousseau to murder 5 men without consequence. The mayor acknowledged that the same systems that protected this killer went on to perpetuate injustice for another century and more, and we must reckon honestly with that history. The 5 men were given a proper burial in Mobile's historically black cemetery. Their names, Samuel, Isaiah, Moses, Benjamin, and Thomas, were inscribed on individual headstones, finally giving them the recognition they had been denied for 188 years. Descendants, along with hundreds of community members, attended the ceremony. Speeches honored not just the 5 victims but all the unnamed people who had tried to bring their story to light and been silenced. A historical marker now stands at the plantation site, describing what happened there and acknowledging both the crimes and the cover-up. The marker includes a QR code linking to digital resources with the full documented history, ensuring anyone can access the evidence. Local schools have begun incorporating the case into curriculum about slavery, institutional racism, and historical memory. But descendants and advocates emphasize that acknowledgement is only the beginning. They're pushing for broader examination of how Southern legal systems systematically protected white perpetrators of violence against enslaved people. They want comparative research into other cases where crimes were buried by institutional complicity. They're demanding that historical preservation in the South include not just mansion tours and heritage celebrations but honest accounting of the violence those systems enabled and protected. The broader significance of this case lies in what it reveals about power, memory, and truth. For nearly 2 centuries, official history denied that these crimes occurred. Records were sealed, witnesses were scattered, evidence was buried. The system that should have delivered justice instead delivered cover-up. But memory persisted, in families who refused to forget, in oral traditions that preserved names and stories, in descendants who insisted that their ancestors' suffering be acknowledged. The revelation of the full truth hasn't erased the crimes or restored what was taken from 5 men whose lives were destroyed in the service of one woman's twisted pursuit of power. But it has restored their names to history. It has exposed the mechanisms of institutional complicity that protected their killer, and it has demonstrated that even when powerful systems conspire to bury truth, human memory, passed down through generations who refuse to forget, can eventually bring that truth to light. Subscribe to the channel to learn more forbidden and forgotten stories. Thank you for following the case of the Magnolia Grove victims. See you in the next video.